Gail, it looks like everybody who was in the waiting room is now on. We should be okay. Oh, one more.
So we're going to talk about behavior intervention plans today and functional behavior assessments. I'm going to give you an overview of both and try to why we do them and how we do them. So it's a two-part process. I'm going to just jump right in because we don't have a lot of time and there's lots of information. So it's two parts. First, we have the functional behavior assessment, and we're going to talk about what it is, why we do them, when we do them, how we do them, and then we'll have a little bit of, we'll have a scenario. Then after you're done with your functional behavior assessment, then you do your behavior intervention plan. And we're going to talk about what that is, why we create them, when we do it, and how we progress and monitor them. Because again, behavior intervention plans are not a punishment. They are to teach a student a skill around behavior. So I know that lots of places when they come to functional behavior assessments, it's all about, okay, one person has the job and that person is in charge of the functional behavior assessment. But in actuality, it should be a team that goes across different settings where that student is. Also, the student should have input as well as a parent. You need to have both views of a student where they do behave and where they don't behave, just so that you can see, because one of the components of a functional behavior assessment is to try to determine if it's happening across settings. A student may be misbehaving in a class, and that teacher may need help with classroom management or behavior for that student, but we're looking to see if it goes across settings. Now, the problem with this is team members. Who do you have on a team? Here are just some suggestions for who you could have on the team. If there's somebody that's not on this list, could you write it in the chat, because maybe we can add to our list. But some of the people that are often overlooked are the cafeteria staff, bus drivers, because those people often see a student in a different situation when the student's really not paying attention to them. The cafeteria staff might notice a student in the lunchroom and behaviors that they might have where the student's not really thinking, oh, that cafeteria lady is looking at me. So these are the people that you don't have to have, you say it says potential, but just people to look at, to think about who might know about this student and their behaviors. The last bullet point I wanted to say about someone with a positive rapport, hopefully in every school, a student with a behavior, there is somebody in that school that student has a positive rapport with. They might be really good in art, so the art teacher sees the student in a different light than the math teacher where the student struggles. So it's really important to try to find a wide range of people when you're looking at a student's behavior. Now, it's when we say teammates, it's not that you have to have all these people all together for meetings all the time. But these are the people that you have to ask the questions about a student's behavior. So Angie, did anybody put anybody else in the chat besides these people?
No, nothing in addition, but I guess I'd want to ask the question, if you could raise your hand or put in the chat, if you have ever completed a functional behavioral assessment all by yourself. I mean, not that you didn't get input from someone else, but like you felt like you were just completing the paperwork to get the paperwork done to say, yes, we've now done the FBA. Because I know I have, and it was so wrong, but I have, just because we had to get it done.
Right, and school psychologists are often the ones where are tasked with doing the functional behavior assessment. And I have watched their faces sometimes when I've been in FIEP meetings, like, what do I do? Who do I ask? I have to do this by myself. It's okay to have one person be the collector of the information. It's okay to have somebody who's going to write out the information, but there has to be a team with input, not only for that person's sanity, but also to get a good picture of the student. To be able to see the student in different light, to try to really figure out what the behavior is about. So did anybody raise their hand to say they'd done it by themselves, Angie?
We've had at least one person that's completed one by themselves, and then another person that mentioned that their behavior consultant does those, which kind of leads me to think the behavior person may be, or behavior consultant may be kind of doing them mostly on their own. I just
Right.
know that, and you'll see kind of as Gail talks about the process, that collecting the data is one thing and getting input together, but sometimes it really does take that team to say, oh, I see a pattern. Because
Right.
sometimes if I have been the one doing all of the collection, I can't see the forest for the trees.
Right, and it's, well, and when we get to the scenario, we'll talk about how you go about that. So when you think about your team, if you could just write in the chat, if you've been a part of a team, what are the challenges of meeting as a team? Or if you're thinking about your school and, oh my gosh, we're going to have to get a team to do functional behavior assessments, what are the challenges of meeting as that team? Has anybody come up with a solution to that? And if you could just write that in the chat. Just because I understand, however, in today's world, it is much easier to figure out ways to get information and to meet as a team, because at some point you do have to meet as a team. Like Angie mentioned, trying to find those patterns and to trying to really talk it out. And again, I am not discounting. If you don't find a pattern, that doesn't mean that an individual teacher is not struggling with a student's behavior and might need some support. But it might not rise to the level of a functional behavior assessment and a behavior plan. Did somebody have a question?
So Sharon marked that time is a challenge, collaboration among team members, and sometimes defining a specific behavior. And I'm
well, right, we are going to talk about that. That is, yes, those are all good points. The other thing I would say about the time, it's absolutely a challenge when you're talking about teams. But I also know that teachers and educators often, when we get together as adults for a meeting, we tend to, because we've spent a day with students, we tend to talk about things other than what the purpose of the meeting is. So, and having been a teacher and a principal, I totally get it. So one thing that I would suggest, if you have an agenda and you stick to your agenda, it will, even if you spend 20 minutes doing the agenda and talking what you need to talk and another 10 minutes about whatever, at least you can get to the point. And that kind of helps people don't feel like their time is wasted when they come to the table, and you can get more done. So the question in the IEP is, there's a behavior of concern. Check yes, check no. If you check yes, there's a behavior of concern that you want to talk about. So the question is, what kind of behavior rises to the level of saying, this is a behavior and I'm going to bring it to the team? If a student is being removed from instruction for part or longer, or from the classroom or from the school because of their behavior, that would rise to the level of bringing the behavior. Now, if you send a student to the back of the room, go sit at that back table, sorry, or go sit in the cubby that child is being removed from instruction because most kids aren't going to sit in the back or sit in a cubby and try to look over the top to see what you are doing. So if a student is being removed from instruction, that's a behavior. Obviously, if they're harming themselves or a danger to others, if they're isolated. Now, sometimes this one's kind of hard because sometimes kids that are isolated from others, we don't always notice, or sometimes we do because they are doing things that kids don't like. For instance, if you have a nose picker, nobody wants to sit next to or work with or talk to that kid. They may be isolated from others. So they have a harder time participating, and that's a behavior that probably should be changed. If the student regularly interrupts the instruction flow, again, that's a behavior that needs to be addressed. And if a student can't walk from point A to point B, pulls everybody off task, is always tapping the kid in front of them, the kid behind him, taps everybody on the shoulder on the way to the pencil sharpener. So those are some behaviors, if you're thinking about how a class in a school is run, those things would rise to the level of bringing the behavior to a teen. So again, we go back to the pattern of behavior. Is it repeated across settings? Sometimes it's a little harder. If it might only happen before Christmas break, because kids are going home and they don't know what's happening at home and they don't really want to go home for 2 weeks, they may start to misbehave. And sometimes some of those take a little longer to figure out. Sometimes it's the structure, like that's why you need different settings, because maybe a student does great in class until they get to gym or until they get to recess, those unstructured times, and then they just have behaviors. So it's trying to figure out the place, the time, the kind of activity. Maybe there's a certain person present or absent. So we have to kind of be that detective to try to cover all bases. Again, this is why, as you can see, it's really important to have different eyes, because even though teachers are very good observers, we can't observe everything for every kid everywhere. So it's looking at these things. And again, I will say this probably more than once today, it's writing the data down. And I can't tell you enough times how important it is to write stuff down and collect data. And it doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be pretty necessarily. It just has to be documented. We'll talk more about that too. So if they impede or interfere with the ability to participate and focus on learning activities, their own or somebody else's, that is a behavior that needs to be addressed. So what does Article 7 say? As we all know, Article 7. So sometimes when we think about that pattern of behavior that Article 7 talks about, sometimes we need to do things before just to kind of see. Teachers do this all the time. You adjust something, right? Kids misbehaving, you move their chair up to the front so they're near you. That's an adjustment. That might work. That might work. You send your para to trail down the hallway with a kid. That might work. And then you may still need to teach a behavior, but at least the behavior isn't across settings and isn't continuing. So you can make small adjustments. You can accommodate. Maybe you move a student's locker from the second floor to the first floor so they don't have to walk through so many hallways, because they don't do well walking through crowded hallways because they're always bumping in or saying someone bumped into them. So maybe just by moving a locker, making that accommodation will solve the problem. Maybe you just need to give the kid instructions. Kids don't come in knowing how to behave at school. I mean, nobody lines up at home to go to the bathroom with their siblings. So we have to constantly teach kids how to behave and remind them and encourage them. And as they go through different grades and the expectations change, we have to, again, keep reminding them and prompting them, because kids usually know what they're not supposed to do. They don't always know an alternative. If parents fight at home, if the way they solve a problem on the street, those may be different than how you solve them in the workplace or in school. But if we don't help kids understand how and alternatives, they're just going to revert to what they know, which is punch them in the face, or get up and run, or just put your head down and not do any work. So sometimes it's just about reminding kids and teaching them the expectations. And sometimes it's hard because as teachers, we like school, we know the expectations, but we sometimes forget that we have to keep reminding students of those. So does the pattern impede his or her learning or that of others? So we need to, the whole point of an IEP is to instruct. So we got to come up with those strategies that are positive behavior interventions, supports to address the behavior. Again, a behavior plan and functional behavior assessments aren't to punish or even reward a kid. It's to say, this is a behavior problem, just like if you would have a reading problem. And what we have to do is we have to teach you a different skill. Just like we would teach kids how to read better, decode, how to do math. We have to do the same thing with behavior. Here's what it says in Article 7, and it's that purpose or function that also is important to have a team. Sometimes you can't always see what the purpose is. For instance, if in geometry class, when geometry class starts, which I hated geometry, if I get up and just start doing a little dance and bothering people and kind of being loud and disruptive, and the teacher sends me out because the teacher thinks that I'm just wanting attention, they have fallen right into my trap, because really what I want is to get out of geometry. So someone else might say, well, you know, Gail didn't do very well in math last year. She doesn't really like math. She's probably trying to get out of class. That's a different function. So you have to have those different eyes on a student, kind of talk it out to figure out what the function of the behavior is. Sometimes it's hard, I will admit. Sometimes it's hard, but it's a work in progress. So when do we do a functional behavior assessment? When we're not sure why the behavior is occurring, when Article 7 says we have to, and when new data is needed to inform an existing behavior plan. One thing about that, if you're in an IEP and meeting and you say, we need more information, a parent can tell you, unless if you're doing something that's required by Article 7, a parent can tell you, no, you can't, no, I'm not going to allow more data to be collected on my student. So you can only use existing data, which is why, as I said earlier, you need to be collecting data and have as much as you can at the time, because you can use that to inform your behavior plan. So again, if you have, it's really important for teachers to understand those, even those side notes, even notes on Post-its, even just side notes or notes that they've put into to a parent, anything. You've got to have the information, because if the parent says they won't let you get new data, you can't get new data. That for you, then you're going to have to wait a long time to be able to do it again, because you're going to have to do it. So is there any questions about that? The parent can tell you no. So it's really important to be collecting data all the time. And again, it doesn't have to look pretty. It just has to be available.
But you have to get an FBA in order to get a BIP, a BIP, right?
Yeah. But if you already have it, but you think you want more information, that's where a parent can tell you no. You have to do it with what you've got. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so you can get it if you're trying to determine eligibility for an emotional disability. That is part of what is required. So if a parent agrees to looking for this eligibility, it's part of it. If the conduct is determined to be manifestation of the student's disability, and as appropriate, even if the manifestation says it's determined not to be a manifestation of the disability, you might want to do, it would be appropriate to do a functional behavior assessment in order to figure out what is going on. If you have kids that have been removed to some sort of interim alternative setting, you would probably want to do one then, and to inform development of behavior intervention plan. So
Gail,
that's,
can I add a couple of things here?
yeah, absolutely.
So the law reads really weird. It never very clearly says, oh, by the way, we need to always do an FBA before we do a behavior intervention plan. But when it talks about behavior intervention plans, it always says based on the function of behavior through an FBA. So it's a little bit tricky there. You will find that there are a lot of districts and special ed cooperatives who may require an FBA in other situations. Some that automatically require it for ADHD when you're looking at other health impairment, or who automatically look at it for all students with autism. And that's outside of the law, because anybody can make policies and procedures that are more restrictive, but always make sure that you know what your district is telling you needs to happen as far as when you might conduct a functional behavioral assessment. Gail, there was also a question in the chat. Karen asked, where's a good place to keep all this data that you're talking about recording?
Oh, good question. Well, I would have, okay, it kind of goes for, if you're the person that's in charge of a functional behavior assessment, one person could be in charge of gathering it all. But sometimes it's those teachers that come and say, this kid has a behavior, right? And it's just a teacher coming and saying, I used to tell all the teachers, keep information, keep a folder. Keep a folder on your desktop, keep a folder, paper copy in your drawer. Just have it so it's available, somehow organized, good or bad information on kids, just notes. Try to, go ahead.
Kim also mentioned that there are a lot of online data collection resources that are free, and some hard copies that you can get on Teachers Pay Teachers.
And also at the end of this PowerPoint, there's on our Padlet, we also have some things where you can keep them. And again, those are helpful. But I used to tell teachers too, like, especially if they see a kid is is having behavior difficulties, start to kind of look like, just jot down, okay, we started reading today and this kid had a problem. Started reading, a week ago, this kid had a problem. And so then you start to have a picture of the student. But there are plenty of stuff online. But again, it can be any way it helps a teacher or any way a teacher can figure out how to do it. But then one person, if a student is having the functional behavior assessment, one person can be in charge of collecting all of it. But it's hard because that question of having existing data, that's sometimes where a teacher will say, well, he does this all the time. And you're like, well, I need that information. Like, I need it now. I need it in writing. And so that's where it helps to have it. But yeah, at the end, I have a link to the Padlet, and on our Padlet, there are some examples. So here again is my example of standing up in class. This is why, again, if it was me and it was geometry and I did this, it really, if every other teacher says, Gail is just an angel in class, she works really hard, that does not go to the level of having to do an assessment and a behavior plan. I need a behavior plan in that class. And that's got to do with that class, but it doesn't go across settings. But you have to figure out the function of the behavior. Is it escape, elopement, avoidance? What is it? That's where it kind of gets tricky. So here are some examples of existing data. Now, attendance, usually you have an attendance person, that's pretty easy to get. Nurses are really good at keeping track of data. If you have someplace, a assistant principal or principal that does referrals, usually that is written. Any kind of behavior charts that teachers keep, observations, checklists, parents, if they call parents and ask questions, they should kind of keep notes on that. And if they just, again, however a teacher determines best, whatever works for them. I've been known to have pieces of tape that I was tallying things on. Whatever works. I'm sure you have other things that you can think of. Existing data, new data, but new data can also go into existing data if you haven't. Here's some. So here's some ideas, and also we won't do this now because we don't have time, but on our Padlet, there are different examples of how you can collect data. Okay, here's another thing that gets hard. It's identifying the area of concern. You got to narrow it down. Review the data, determine if you need more, get permission if you need it. You're going to analyze it, come up with a hypothesis, and then review the hypothesis. Now, one other thing that often is hard, and we're going to go through a scenario, is language. And let's just start. Okay, so this is the first information. We're just going to do a fifth grader and going to ask for some input. So a fifth grade teacher comes and tells you that Sammy is oppositional and non-compliant. He used to be compliant at the beginning, but it's gotten worse. He crumbles up his paper, puts his head down on his desk, and is off task. One of the problems is, I know you have questions. Write in the chat, what is one of your first questions? If this is what the teacher said, what is one thing you would want to know? Do I got any answers, Angie?
They're starting to come. What has changed,
Okay.
right? Because so if he was compliant at first and now he's not, what has changed?
Okay.
What subject is it where most of his behaviors occur?
Okay.
At what time of day or subject? We're looking for those patterns. Is there a pattern of his behavior?
Okay. Great.
Can I add to this?
Yes.
What the heck does oppositional and non-compliant mean? Like, I don't know what that looks like.
Okay.
Anything
Great.
changed at home?
Right.
Yeah,
So,
good questions.
yeah, so absolutely good questions. And like to Angie's question, oppositional and not compliant or disruptive, those kinds of, when teachers come to you with those kinds of words, you do have to ask some questions because every teacher's answer to oppositional, non-compliant, defiant, disruptive, everybody has a different level of, everybody's answer is different. I've had teachers say, oh my gosh, this kid taps his pencil incessantly. And as a teacher of students with emotional disabilities in a self-contained class, I'd be happy if all they did was tap their pencil. So, but I'm not discounting that teacher that it doesn't bother her. So sometimes you have to look at the words and think, is that a clear cut? Does everybody know what that looks like? So, all right. So you've got some good questions for Mr. Kennett. So here's what we know after we ask some questions. Here's what we know now. That Sammy has been sent to the office 7 times for ripping up and crumpling up his work. He doesn't know how many prompts he's given to Sammy. He believes that Sammy has missed recess multiple times to complete his work. He's tried to reach Sammy's mom 3 times, but has not yet really connected with her. Sammy struggles in reading, math, and writing, but his iLearn scores are near grade level. He has good attendance, but he goes to the nurse a lot for a headache, stomach ache. The nurse says he's been there at least 15 times, and he usually stays about 15 minutes. So you have a little clearer picture of Sammy. Now, what are your questions? And what are your questions? Like, what other information would you need, or what data would you need in order to get a clearer picture of Sammy that Mr. Kennett hasn't given you?
They want to know differences between home and school. They want to talk to the nurse about his symptoms and what is he ripping up? What work is it?
Awesome. Good job. Okay. Great answers. Okay. So again, here's the question when we asked Mr. Kennett to really describe oppositional and non-compliant. So he says, when he gives instructions to the class to start work, Sammy doesn't start. When he prompts him individually, sometimes he starts, sometimes he puts his head down on his desk, crumples up his work, tears it, throws it on the floor. Sometimes he does nothing and he just sits. But if it's anything else, any other general kind of requests, line up, take your seat, he is fine. He is always compliant, generally compliant. So does that help you any, or what more information do you want from Mr. Kennett? And who maybe do they need to talk to still that they haven't talked to yet?
All right. Has he asked any questions to ascertain if Sammy understands the instructions? because he needs to check for understanding.
Good job.
Any data from Title I or RTI. And Jennifer said it appears they've really narrowed it down to more academic stuff.
Yep.
And has Mr. Kennett checked out with the bus driver, PE teacher, lunchroom monitor, etc.? Have you
Good.
approached the lessons in a different capacity?
Awesome. Good answers. Okay. So we initially had the oppositional non-compliant off task, destroying work, putting his head down. So now we kind of got it more specific. It's initiating work tasks. He destroys paper, and that's the nurse, the headache. So that question, that answer about, yeah, we need to know a little bit more from the nurse. What does the nurse do? Or she just let him lie down? What does she do? Okay, so here's some things that we might help us, but we still haven't talked, we really haven't done any interviews besides Mr. Kennett. So we did some more information, got some more information. The behavior occurs when work tasks were reading, math, or writing that were new or somewhat new. If it was a review, he was fine. Or if it was art-based, he was fine. It didn't matter what time of the day, it didn't matter which teacher, didn't matter the day of the week. Unstructured settings like the lunchroom, recess were fine. It was only those academic, it was only in the classroom. He finally got a hold of the parent. The parent said, I see kind of the same things at home when I'm working on homework. When it's new, I struggle. When it's review, he's fine. So are we getting a better picture now? Who do they still need to talk to? I don't know why they don't do this first. But, okay. So, he didn't have any rating scales, but they did do a classroom observation. So what the observer saw was that Sammy, when the teacher was transitioning to in-class seat work, Sammy started to get outwardly anxious. So he was like putting his head down, kind of looking around, kind of moving around in his seat. His whole body posture was changing as Mr. Kennett was passing out the papers for the seat work. The teacher, if Sammy didn't start, would give him a verbal prompt and then do that physical prompt where, you know, tapping on the paper, let's get busy. If once Sammy tore up the paper, he was sent to the office to cool off. So, any ideas?
So we have a comment that maybe his anxiety of being wrong or his peers watching him could be playing a part in this.
Yeah, good. Okay. So now they finally talked to Sammy. Sammy hates school. It's too hard. I don't like it when people make fun of me if I ask for help. I don't like to go back and erase. I like to do art, and I don't care if I have to stay in from recess because I can get help. So now we have a really clear picture of Sammy. I mean, any fifth grade, he obviously wants to learn because he's willing to stay in to recess for learning. But to the person's point that said he's doesn't like the other kids looking at him or he's afraid to ask. I mean, I think sometimes we forget that kids are kind of self-absorbed and they don't realize that maybe the person next to him is always asking a question and getting an answer and nobody's making fun of them. But to him, it's people are making fun of me. I don't want to ask for help. So now we have a clear picture of Sammy. So once you have a picture of Sammy and you've entered the information, you have to come up with a hypothesis. So when something happens, Sammy is going to do this and why. You might have a kid, or even for Sammy, you might have more than one statement. And if you do, again, like other goals, you need to be sure you have single things. You can't say when 3 things happen, he's likely to do 4 things to avoid or gain 6 things. You have to keep it more succinct than that. What? Did somebody have a comment? Okay. So, does anybody have any other questions about Sammy? Or maybe things that could be done to help Sammy? Or Mr. Kennett? I got anything, Angie?
Not yet.
Okay, we're good. I'm going to keep going. So, again, you have your hypothesis. You kind of figure out what, if you need any more data or if you can go ahead. So now you've got your functional behavior. Now we're going to build a plan. Here's Article 7 for the plan. Elisa likes to put in these so people don't have to hunt through it, through Article 7 to find out the pieces of it if you need to use it. So again, Article 7 says you can develop a plan as part of a disciplinary process for a manifestation or a change of placement. When the behavior impedes the student's learning or the learning of others, or if there's a plan in place and you need to review it. But again, I know it's part of a disciplinary process, but it should be, as we'll talk about in a minute, it should be that you are going to teach the kid a skill to change that behavior. It's not a punishment to say, if you do this and this, you're out forever. Or if you do this and this and this, we're going to reward you with a special treat. It needs to be something that is taught. So you have the specially designed instruction, and specially designed instruction is what the adults are going to do. So what could Mr. Kennett do to help Sammy not tear up his paper? What could he do? Anybody? Any ideas? Could he, what instruction or what accommodation?
There's at least one thing here in the chat. He likes projects, so modify his assignments, approach the assignment differently, maybe give him an electronic version, have a buddy. You can tell we got a lot of special ed teachers in here.
You have to be
dry
careful
erase board. Approach Sammy calmly, possibly a peer buddy.
Yeah, those are all good. But remember, be careful using that word modify, because you can accommodate, but you don't really want to modify it and change what's being taught for kids that are on the diploma track. But those are all.
Maybe give him an alternate way to provide answers.
Oh, there's a good one. Or because it seems like he just struggles because if something is new, maybe you could have like a little pre-teach or give him a list of this is what we're going to do next week. So you can have it a little bit ahead of time so he's not so nervous. I even thought of, if you make the effort to point out when other kids are asking questions, like, hey, Sarah, that was a really great question. I bet a bunch of people have that question, just to get that idea that other people are asking questions. But I like your accommodations and environmental supports. Yeah, the dry erase board or a buddy. When you have that new thing, having partners, that would be awesome.
I think
Gail,
one of the most challenging things is to make sure that whatever that function is that came out of the functional behavioral assessment, that you are building a plan to get his need, that function met,
right,
by doing things without him doing the behavior we don't want to see. And I
Right.
think sometimes we do a heck of an FBA, and then when we write the behavior plan, we forget that, oh my gosh, we have an FBA and we have a hypothesis of the function of behavior. So we write what we think is a beautiful plan that doesn't work because we haven't really used that good information that came from the functional behavioral assessment.
Yeah, I would agree. And you have to think about like what would be life-changing for Sammy. When you think about kids with behavior, and usually a kid with a behavior has more than one. And you have to think about, like, for Sammy, which thing, if you could change one thing, what would be life-changing? Because oftentimes, sometimes if we can change one thing, it kind of snowballs and then other behaviors stop. So is it self-efficacy for Sammy? I can do it. Would that change everything? Would it be communication that he learns to say to the teacher, this makes me nervous. I don't know how to do it when you first start. Or problem solving. I'm going to work with a friend to try to help me. I mean, which one of these things would be life-changing? Because again, sometimes we don't look at, like Angie said, we don't look at all the pieces that we have and try to think about really what is this student saying, and how do we address that? I mean, if you're a teacher that makes everybody read out loud, you can, if you're an observer, you can see the student that is counting paragraphs because they don't want to read out loud and they will disrupt the class so they don't have to read. So how do you change that? What can you do for a kid that's life-changing? Because again, maybe if you can make Sammy understand I can do it, and that self-efficacy, then maybe his problem solving and his ability to communicate, all those other things fall into place. Something to think about. I'm sure there's other things on here that we could put that would be life-changing for students. Oftentimes, if students are ones that are fighting, right? Is it that conflict resolution, communication, being compassionate, understanding that compassion, I mean, what is the thing that would work? Sometimes we don't get it right. Sometimes it's trial and error. Sometimes our first hypothesis might be wrong. And that's where, if you do the work and you have different hypotheses from the behavior, and when you go back because you think this isn't working, we need to go look at the plan. Somebody needs to have kept all that because I'm not one for doing it all over again. Use what you have and say, hey, we tried this one, but we had this other hypothesis. Let's try it. So you need to keep all the information once you have it. So identify one or two replacement behaviors that Sammy could be taught. So in the chat, kind of answer these questions or throw out one words to, like, what would you replace his behavior with? What kind of supports might you put in place? And then what data would you collect to see if it was working? Because Mr. Kennett he didn't know how many prompts he had given Sammy at the beginning.
And this is kind of similar. You guys offered some really great strategies, and depending on the function of behavior for Sammy, some of those might work and some of those may do absolutely no good. So it depends on what you thought was really the potential function of behavior for Sammy. Is he trying to get out of things that are hard? Is he trying to get one-on-one adult attention because that seems to work for him? What in the world is going on that's leading to that? And so now if you have a good idea of what the function is, then your replacement behaviors are kind of driven by that as well. So I need a behavior that will get me what I need, but in an appropriate way. So again, if I'm somebody who needs to escape something, whether it's difficult work or chaotic room or escape the attention of peers that I don't want because I'm getting anxious, what is a behavior that will help that to happen, but in an appropriate way, rather than tearing up my work or saying I'm sick and I need to see the nurse? If I'm needing adult attention, what is a way I could get that in a more appropriate way? What is a replacement behavior there? So everything really in the behavior plan is driven by what you think that function of behavior is.
Right. And sometimes, I mean, you can get it, but a kid will change on you because they are thinking, okay, they've got this. Now I'm going to try something different. So that's again why you have to keep track of your data.
Oh, and Karen asks, so then you'd have to continue to collect data on the replacement behaviors. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. You keep having to collect data, whatever you decide, but it should be easier because your behavior, it should be observable, measurable, and mine just went blank. Everybody, and recognizable, so that everybody should know what the behavior looks like and how we're going to measure it. Everybody should know. So that's why those words like non-compliant and oppositional don't really work. But if you are going to say, we're going to give you a replacement behavior for tearing up your work, everybody knows what tearing up papers looks like, right? Everybody knows what putting your head down. So you need to have some way to, it's got to be recognizable, observable, and measurable. And everybody has to understand what it looks like.
She had a couple of ideas in the chat of coming up with a hand signal for when he needs help. Finding a way for him to recognize when he's feeling this way. And instead of tearing his paper up, he could use a different signal to the teacher, and modeling and encouragement of how to even start things.
Yep. Yeah, those are good. Yeah. Oh, good. So SDI, just as a reminder, is what instruction is going to be given to Sammy by the adult to give him replacement. Not what Sammy's going to do, it's what the adults are going to do to help him with whatever we've decided is going to be the goal, and to look for a replacement, whatever that looks like. This is what the adult is going to do. Maybe he needs an accommodation, right? Maybe he needs less, just the time. Maybe for Sammy, it's that input. He needs to have some way to get the information ahead of time, a little pre-teach, so that he's not so nervous about new information. Maybe he needs to think about his own feelings, right? How little kids do the little faces. How are you feeling today? Maybe he needs a different level of support. Maybe he needs the help of a shoulder buddy to turn and talk. You just have to be careful with the accommodations when you talk about the size. If you're reducing the number, it's okay to reduce the number, only just be sure it's the same thing as everybody else. So an easy example is if you're doing math and it's multiplication and division, you have to do both kinds of problems. You can't just do the multiplication. So, and the time, I would say be careful about adjusting the amount of time, because you don't want kids to get behind because they have so much longer than everybody else. So think, especially as the older they get, when the pace and rigor kind of steps up. So you want to be careful with those. But the rest. So here are some environmental supports. like the pacing. Sometimes it's just those predictable routines, creating some sort of visual, spatial schedule, um, organizing. Some kids can't organize. Increasing the understanding of elapsed time. I've seen lots of teachers use those clocks that they can project that counts down the time for them. So those are just some environmental supports that you can put in. What you have to be sure of is when you put these things in is that everybody knows. We'll talk about that in a minute. So here are some other ideas. Teaching the students how to chunk. Probably teachers do this all the time, but sometimes you have to be more specific for certain kids to do it. Movement is huge. The accept reservations. Elisa had gone into a class. It was I think she said it was a high school early morning class, and there were all these like cafe tables around the outside of the room, and the kids could make a reservation. So because a lot of the kids in high school worked or had sports practices and games, so if they were going to be late, in order to like know they were going to stay awake, they would make a reservation and they would stand and listen to the teacher do the lesson standing at a table instead of sitting in a desk. There were always evidently a couple of tables where it was like emergency, like I didn't know I had to work last night, so I need to stand up today. So that's what that reservation is. Sometimes it's okay to have a fidget or doodle or sketch. You can still listen. And for Sammy, maybe that calming, learning how to calm himself, because it seems like he gets all anxious and that just makes it worse and worse about this new assignment. So anyway, those are just some things that teachers can do. So now, here comes the next hard part. And I have seen the best behavior plans not work because of simple things. So when you're going to implement your interventions, you have to monitor the fidelity of the instruction. Fidelity is huge. That's why everybody needs to know what the behavior looks like and what's going to happen, like what you're going to do, how you're going to count it, and what instruction is going to be given. Because a student will find the weakest link. Or if the behavior plan's not working when you come back to the table, you first have to look at the fidelity piece. Not the student, but the fidelity. Because if we're not doing it with fidelity, then you can't really say if it's working or not. Now, I know it's really hard. When I was the principal and at the School for the Blind and in charge of all the case conferences in elementary school, I would have, when I realized that it happened, so at the end of the conference, I would assign people, specific people. You're going to tell these people, you're going to tell the bus drivers, you're going to tell whoever needed to know. And then they had to email me when they were, the task was accomplished. So at least I would know everybody knew, because that can make or break your behavior. And you have to figure out how you're going to document. And then obviously you have to report your progress. And again, I would say the teacher of record pretty much has to be the one that's at least putting the information into the IEP system, because you don't want a lot of people in the system. But that doesn't mean that the teacher of record can't have other people helping them collect the information. They just have to be the one to put it in. Does anybody have questions about that?
Gail, I don't see any questions, but I think you make a really good point that Um, for most of you, I would imagine most of the group on here today are special education teachers, or I can see some people who I know are supervisors or directors. Even when you have a student on your caseload, they are not with you the whole day for most of you. And so it is critical that everybody knows their piece of this. There are so many complaint cases, due process cases, people who go into manifestation determinations and find that there was a failure of implementation of the IEP because a behavior plan, although it may have been beautifully written, was not implemented with fidelity. And that's a critical piece. So just making sure that if you do have other people collecting data, because you're not glued to the hip with your kids, that they know what kind of data you need so that you can efficiently then get it documented in the system.
Right. And that's where it has to be specific, because you don't want somebody, I mean, because again, kids have multiple behaviors, but whatever you're doing for the behavior plan is one thing. So yes, they can make note of other behaviors, but they really need to just be looking at that one for purposes of documentation. And the other thing too is you do need to have different people, because if I'm the teacher and I walk in, if I'm the special ed teacher, and so I walk into the math class at the same time every day, that kid knows, okay, she's here, I'm going to act differently. So you want to have different people at different times of the day taking data for you. Paras are good because they're sometimes with the kid and they can, if they're with the students a lot, kids kind of just get used to them being there. I mean, you don't want to whip out your clipboard and start staring at somebody and marking something, but they can get the information. So it is so important. That fidelity piece is so important. But again, people can't do it if they don't know. And sometimes we walk out of those meetings and forget, oh, I needed to tell the gym teacher and the art teacher and, you know, the bus driver, or I need to tell the nurse that, you know, I'm going to come down because Sammy shows up every day and we're trying to get him to stop. So I need you to, whatever it is. So that fidelity piece, as Angie pointed out too, sometimes gets you into trouble. So however, those of you that are PARs for conferences, figure out a way to be sure that when you have those behavior plans, that the message is getting to whoever needs to have it. All right. So again, here's what you have to think. Who's going to be responsible for teaching Sammy the replacement skill? Maybe it's not Mr. Kennett. Maybe it's somebody different. Who's going to collect it? And if that's the other thing besides the fidelity, if something has to change in the environment, let's say Sammy has to sit at the front of the room. And that's where he needs to sit in every class. Somebody needs to make sure that in every class, Sammy's sitting in the front. If a student needs to walk a certain way from point A to point B in the hallway, and you have a school that's big and there's multiple ways, someone needs to make sure that that happens every time. If there's so those kinds of things are what sometimes the kid will figure out where it's not working. Even the smallest kid will figure out where the adults aren't paying attention and they will take advantage. So you have to be sure that the adults are all on the same page. I don't know how they do it, but they do. So how is the team going to know if Sammy's successful? Anybody? How are we going to know if if his plan is working? might
I
be
see an answer. If the behavior diminishes, that's
right.
Allison's input there. I think that's
Yep.
a good one. We also have, is he able to demonstrate the target behavior? So, and do that independently. So you may be collecting a decrease in the behavior that you didn't want, or you may be collecting data on, okay, here's what I want you to do, and let's collect that.
Right.
We've got a lot of different ways that we can pull that information together.
Right. And even think about it, like even the nurse, maybe, okay, so Sammy's only gone 2 times to the nurse instead of 15. That might be working because he hasn't left math class or reading class to go to the nurse. So that might be another way to see that it's working, that your plan is working. Sometimes you might have to, I don't want to say teach, but sometimes you might have to, when you have a kid with a lot of behaviors and you're only looking at one, you might have to do a little more teaching to the people that are going to interact with the student so they know exactly which of the behaviors you're looking at. Or you might say, I just want you to do it in a 10-minute time frame, like one day at the beginning of the class, another at the end, and another in the middle. But so you might have to do a little bit of teaching if you're going to have some support staff or people that aren't as familiar with what the behavior looks like in order to get good information. Okay, now on your IEPs, there's this little button that says when you're like reviewing and you've already had the plan, you're going to determine whether you're going to implement it as written or if you need to make revisions. Now, one reason I point this, Elisa and I point this out, is because hopefully there is somebody in, when you get kids that move in, there is somebody that reviews the IEP. Because if a student has a behavior plan, you really need to look at it really carefully to be sure that what is in there, your school and district can reasonably take over. Because as Elisa points out, she got one once because that was her job, and the school they came from had built a special timeout room for this student. And in the classroom, a special room with a door in the classroom. And I know I taught in an open concept class, open concept school, which that would have been really hard to try to do. So we would have had to come up with, okay, how are we going to implement this IEP the way it was written there? What can we put into place that is not we're not building a room, but where we can accommodate this kind of behavior. So just like when you look at all the other academic kind of pieces of it, it's really important when you go into IEPs and you're looking at them that are coming in that you really look at the behavior plans. And some of them aren't going to be the IEP system, maybe, if you have them coming from out of state. So you really need to look and just check it. Do you have any questions about that? I know so much. Okay, so if Sammy's not making any progress on his anxiety and his tearing up the paper, then you need to go back and you need to review the plan. Check on that fidelity piece. I always checked on the fidelity piece first. That was always my first question. Is everybody doing it? Is everybody doing it this way? Because if so, yeah, we need to move on. If not, that's the place where I'm going to go first. If Sammy's making progress, then you're just going to keep doing what you're doing. And if Sammy does it, then you're going to have a party. You're going to say, woohoo, you did it. And I think we don't always do that. That's another reason why it's really important to have that one, not 15 things, because you might get 3 of them, but you can't get the other 12. So whatever the goal is you have for Sammy, if he gets it, then that's, I mean, the goal is to be able to discontinue behavior plans. And I think sometimes we have kids that just keep having them and having them and having them and having them because we aren't really teaching those replacement skills. We're using it as a punishment. So, because just like any other goal, if a kid gets it, we should celebrate and say, this is awesome. You did it. I'm so proud of you. That life-changing moment for this student. So celebrate the good things. Okay, so sometimes teachers managing surface behaviors, sometimes teachers do things and they just don't know. Sometimes they don't know what it's called, and sometimes they don't know that they just need to do this, and this can change behaviors in their classrooms. So things like proximity. We all know if you walk around and you stand next to kids, often they will stop doing whatever they're doing. Somebody I think talked about earlier, Sammy, with the signal inferences. So again, kind of that, and it can kind of change as kids get older, whether it's like a hand, some people I've seen put cards on the table, and if a kid needs help, they'll turn it over so that, or they'll put their pencil a certain way so that it clues the teacher that they need help. Planned ignoring, sometimes that's really hard because they will push and push, but those are all things that you can manage surface behaviors. The triage chart is something that Elisa and I found from a district that was working with kids with really more severe behaviors. It is very labor intensive, and there's an example of it in our Padlet, but it goes through everything from the COM to the triggers all the way through back to recovery, and it tells you what it looks like and what the teacher should do and how the teacher should approach it. And
Gail,
the one
can
thing
I add with that triage chart, because
Yeah.
the first time that I saw that, I thought, yeah, that's going to take a lot of time, but man, could it get ahead of some of the behaviors. So when it's something that would take a team quite a bit of time to build what it truly looks like at different levels for students, because there are a lot of students that I'll hear a teacher say, he goes from 0 to 100 just like that, right? He's fine, and then he's not fine. And the more that you observe a student and start really picking apart the behaviors, you start to see that it's not from 0 to 100 that fast. There are gradients in between. And when we can identify what does it look like when I'm just starting to get agitated, what does it look like when I bumped up to that next level, then we can start to put things in place and support the student at that lower level so that they don't get all the way to 100.
Right.
So
And the other
it's
thing,
a great chart.
right. And the other thing I like, it gives statements for the teacher to make, which when you have kids like this, one of the biggest difficulties, and I know, is that behaviors are emotional. And it's hard because if kids are getting 0 to 60, you're getting agitated, adults are getting nervous, you tend to start pushing back. But what's good is that then this gives language to everybody. So if that other teacher that's not used to working with kids or a para can just pull out the card and state what's on the card, it takes the emotionality and the thinking, oh no, what do I do, out of it. So like Angie and I both pointed out, this takes a lot of work, but for those kids that are really difficult, for a team to sit down and do this, it will reap great rewards, because again, you can give words to say to people that are with the student when the teacher of record isn't there, that they can just say this, and that takes all the thinking out of it for that person. So it is in the Padlet. So it's just something to look at. So here's a QR code for the Padlet. And, oh, good. So we have about 10 minutes left. So I wanted to leave some time for questions. And then everybody will get a certificate and the recording. And if you would go to the evaluation, that would be great. But does anybody have any questions?
Or is there anything that anyone's really struggling with in their FBAs or behavior plans where you're working?
Yeah. What's your biggest barrier or problem or question?
We'll give this a minute because I know just writing this out in the chat would be hard. But again, we're a small group. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have anything to add.
Yeah. I know it's been a lot of information, but
Getting the rest of staff on board and ready to go. Absolutely.
oh gosh.
Allison, I think, that's one thing that can be a challenge is that when students misbehave a lot and become a pain in the butt, sometimes we think there should be consequences. Like they need to have a punishment of some sort. Not us, of course. I mean, in the world of special ed, we usually aren't thinking that. But a lot of our coworkers may be thinking, but wait a minute, they just did this. And you're talking about supports and reinforcing positive behavior. Yeah, we are, because that's what works. And I think the process, even though I know it's a little time intensive, the way that the system is set up, the process really has taken us from a mindset of writing a plan that is basically nothing more than restating the code of conduct and the progressive discipline consequences that might happen to a student if they do something, to thinking about it from the framework of, as a student, I either don't know a skill that I should be using, or I'm just not good at that skill. I'm not well practiced in it, or I don't have an environmental situation where I can use that skill, even if I have it in my files somewhere, right? And so really creating a plan that's going to support that is what gets us the results that we're looking for.
Right. And I do think that that's a hard thing to sometimes remember, is that students often, I mean, most of the time, they know that whatever they're doing is not what they should be doing. They just don't know what to do. So instead of saying, don't do this, don't do that, that's great. I know that, but I don't know what to do instead. And again, when we think about where they might be coming from, or how they see problems solved, or how they see how other people react, that's what they're seeing. They need to be taught, okay, but this is what we do here. This is how you can solve this problem a different way. So, and I know it's hard. And again, I would not discount if you have an individual teacher that's just struggling with a student, even if it doesn't rise to the level of an FBA or a BIP, that doesn't discount the fact that they are struggling with that student. And so if they're struggling, then that student probably isn't getting the most out of that class. So some classroom management, or some ideas for those surface behaviors, or maybe ideas for approaching the kid in a different way. Again, I think sometimes we say, oh, we don't have time. This kid isn't that bad, that's your problem. But sometimes we need to give those teachers some support too. So.
Hey, Gail, I'm not seeing any other questions on here.
Okay. Well, then thanks everybody. I appreciate your time, and if you have other questions, if you have questions that you think of afterwards, or you're looking through the Padlet, and truthfully, if you look through the Padlet and you think, oh, I have a really good resource for this, if you send it my way or Elisa's way, we can add it to the Padlet so that other people can have that resource too. Because hey, we could always use some more. So here's both Elisa and my information. So if you think of questions again, or if you have a resource that we have not included on the Padlet, send it our way and we can add it so others can, we can share.
And I know a couple of you came in a little bit late, so you will get the full recording of today that'll be sent out to you as well.
Yep. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody and have a good rest of your evening.